As a beginning player, I had a great deal of difficulty in not losing right away. Like I would be making all sorts of wrong moves. And it was only after, terrible pounding and being beaten like a drum that I came up with my own ideas about what I should do in the opening. And one of the things I started doing when I was both on the black side as well as the white army was I would create a fortress, or what I imagined to be a fortress. My opening move with white was d2, d3. It's not a particularly good move, but I'm just explaining how I kind of evolved in my thinking. So why did I do that? Well, you'll see in a moment. It's almost against any move that black could conceive. For example, black might conceive of moving his pawn here, which is a very natural move in the opening to try to occupy the center. My response was to develop my knight. Let's say he in turn develops his knight, and my response was to play g3. So the idea, and again, kind of my childish imagination, was that my bishops needed to be on the long diagonal. Because if I put my bishop on the long diagonal, it was going to be very effective. So I would play g3, and it doesn't matter what my opponent would play. For example, my opponent might play c5. I would play bishop g2. My opponent might, for example, play knight c6, and I would castle. So in this way, what I was thinking was, I'm going to lose the game. Okay? We already know I'm going to lose the game. That goes without saying, because I just simply didn't know what I was doing. But I'm not going to lose the game in 2 moves, or 4 moves, or 6 moves. I put my king in what I conceived as my fortress. I would fianchetto the bishop. My pawn's nice pawn shield. The bishop stands in front of my king, using extra protection. My knight is good. My rook protects my king. So my king, I imagine, was in some kind of a fortress. Then, long term, my idea was that this bishop was on this diagonal, and I should clear a path. So, for example, my opponent would play a move like e5, again a very reasonable move, controlling the center, occupying the center. And in my mind, what I should do is I should knock this guy out away. So if I could get my opponent to play a move, for example, like d4, I was very pleased, because I thought, hey, long term, that bishop is like on a really good diagonal. And maybe one day I get really lucky and I capture his rook here. So why did I play the move d3 on my opening move? Well, the reason I played d3 is because what would happen to me when I was black. Keeping in mind that what I wanted to do when I was black or white, it didn't matter, was create a fortress. This happened to me several times. That from the starting position, my opponent, as white, keeping in mind my wonderful experienced opponent, would play e4. Now, I would play knight f6. My opponent would attack my knight, and I would try to fianchetto and make a fortress, and my opponent would take my knight. Well, that sucks. Like 2 moves into the game and I already lost my Cavallero? I mean, dang, that was really terrible. So, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and out came e4, d6. Ah, now we understand the genius. So if he went here, I immediately went here, of course. He would have he would play here. I'm not even sure it even occurred to me, by the way, that I was necessarily attacking his pawn. That had nothing to do with the concept of what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was simply be in shadow my king and bishop, and I don't really care. I mean, some move like check, by the way, I think I would have tried to castle, you know, because I just knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to get that set up. I'd have my fortress, and then I'd lose, and that was okay. But it sure beat getting checkmated in 3 moves, which also happened to me, of course, when I tried to do copy my opponent. So here, of course, today, I would just thank my opponent for the tempo, and I played c6, blocking the threat. And my next move, castles. I also remember, I have this very, very vivid memory of this happening to me. I was white, and again, this is in my beginning days, and I didn't fully even understand what I should be doing. So I opened up with a move like d3. So only much later, when I had evolved and I had advanced and my knowledge of chess had taken a quantum leap forward, did I understand that I should make a fortress. At this moment, it didn't occur to me that I should make a fortress. My opponent played the move d5. So I played d4. Very, very crafty, right? Copying my opponent, figuring, you know, like, I would mimic exactly the moves of my opponent until, you know, brilliance took over and I would play my own moves. So he played e5, I played e4. Okay, copying, like figuring this out, play along here for a moment. And my opponent played bishop g4. Now, of course, this is a terrible move, and I should simply take the darn bishop. So I didn't consider that, of course. My main move was bishop g5, right? Copying my opponent, but something smelled wrong. Like, man, those pawns were in great conflict with one another. Like, whoa, you know, like, okay, here's where I figured I should take one or the other, and I couldn't quite decide. So I went captures, which is a great move, right? You know, taking advantage of. Now my opponent played an incredibly remarkable move. Yes?
Bishop takes d1.
That would be a very, very strong move. In fact. But he played even a much more remarkable move than that. He went bishop b4 check and mate. I was like, oh, wow. Mate?
That's not mate.
Mate? Of course it's not mate. Wow. He explained to me that those bishops, my king couldn't move, he had me, and I went, wow, and somebody came.
Can't you move your queen to d2?
I could move my queen to d2, my bishop to d2, my pawn. I could put my knight in the way. Now, this gets even better. A guy who's walking along, this is like in a park, right? He walks along, he looks, he goes, wow, that's a great checkmate. So, you know, confirmation. I say, oh man, okay, let's try again. And my opponent was so kind. He was such a sweet person. He said to me, don't worry about it. You're like, that's the 3rd time I got somebody like this. Man, so like, bang, boy, I tell you. So openings were terrible.
I don't see checkmate.
Oh, it's not. It's not.
That's the joke.
No,
That's the joke. It's a joke. It's not checkmate.
But he had people who just said, "Oh, okay, you win."
Okay, you win. It's checkmate.
Oh my God!
And I was like this third victim in this fabulous, brilliant checkmate in Paris. Okay, so that's how bad I really was.
So we can, you've established you started with humble beginnings.
It was very, very humble beginnings. So in this.
Didn't you see it?
No, you think I was good? No, I wasn't born good. I was born terrible. I was a horrible chess player. And I would lose all my games, beaten like a drum. Somebody would point out that I was checkmated. It was a 50-50 shot, whether it was true or not. What can I tell you? So one of the real difficulties I had to overcome, both as a beginning novice player as well as once I started getting a rating and things like that, was finding an opening defenses that I found suitable. And again, as I started this lecture, I wanted to throw it back at yourselves and say, does anybody have questions about openings? And I'll take you through them and how I started thinking about openings and what I did. So please,
Queen's Gambit.
Queen's Gambit's a good one, and yourself? Queen's Gambit, okay.
Accepted or declined.
Accepted or declined, exactly. So it's very funny today that in chess there are basically two main opening moves for white. White can play e4, occupying the center, or d4, occupying the center. So at one time I played e4. That came later because I read that Bobby Fischer said e4 was best by test. I said, good enough for Bobby, good enough for me. I'll play e4. What I didn't realize is it's probably the single most heavily analyzed opening for white, and that the black players, if they're experienced, will have their defenses really well researched. And I was forever behind the 8-ball, so to speak, in my theoretical knowledge of e4. Later in life, I would play c4 because this was a less trodden path. This was the English opening, and I didn't have to learn so much opening theory. Then much later, when I became a very strong Grandmaster, I actually started playing d4 almost exclusively. Okay, so let's see what the pluses and the minuses are here. First of all, in terms of e4, I mentioned already that there's so much theoretical knowledge that I needed that it was overwhelming. d4, equally, there's a lot of theoretical knowledge, but one of the things I liked about d4, or at least I evolved in my thinking, I came to like about d4, is that it wasn't so sharp. In other words, the openings were softer. It wasn't like in e4, the game could hinge on a single tempo or a single turn. So I like d4, and I came to like it best. Now, from black's point of view, there's tons of moves he can play. There's tons of moves. You can play c5, you can play b5, you can play d5, e5, knight f6. You could play g6, a kind of a modern. Classically speaking, d5 is the oldest response to d4, and understandably so. White takes space in the center. Black, in turn, takes space in the center. Now, after hundreds of years, it's considered that c4 is the natural follow-up, and we get what is called the Queen's Gambit. So it gets the term gambit because it does offer black the opportunity of capturing this pawn if he likes. And so now there's the Queen's Gambit accepted, pawn takes. There's what is called the Queen's Gambit declined, e6. This is probably the oldest move. And there is what is called the Slav Defense. So the Slav Defense is black plays c7, c6, and fortifies his center, so he's willing to trade. Slav Defense has one small drawback. The knight on b8 says, hey man, you just occupied my best square, dude. Are you sure you want to do that? Young man, I have a question.
How do you fall out the Queen's Gambit when the Queen's Gambit accepted, when he takes?
Okay, so we have, for example, the Queen's Gambit accepted. Well, when I was starting chess, you know, like, man, it really troubled me that my opponent captured a pawn and I wanted it back. I wanted it back really quickly. So one thing I could do is I could check and I could take this pawn back very quickly. But later I would learn that this move and bringing out your queen early wasn't a very good idea. And I learned that e3 was a good response. Now black could, for example, play b5 to protect his pawn. But I can attack this pawn. He can't play a6 because there's going to be a pin on the rook. So he could play c6, defending his pawn. I could take. And here I'll just pause for a brief moment and talk about development for just a moment. So in chess, we are properly taught, and I think it's absolutely accurate, that we move our pieces off the back rank to help develop them. But sometimes, on those rare occasions, it actually just turned out right now that I haven't moved my rook, but my rook's developed. Why is that? Well, it turns out that my rook has this open file, so the rook is actually very useful on its original square. And with the move e3, I want to win the pawn back. If my opponent captured this pawn, then I really like that. Just a minute, I'll get to you, Julian. I really like this. I was told what this was called. I don't recapture the pawn, but I played an intermezzo. I thought that was such a cool word. Once I learned what intermezzo was, it's an Italian move, an Italian word. It means an in-between move. Before I capture this, I first capture this pawn with check, and if he defends his king, by the way, it's not checkmate. If he defends his king, I would take this pawn, and in the development count, I'd have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces developed, or 4 units developed, against his 1, and I'd have an advantage. Julian?
Instead of playing b3, why not queen f3 winning a piece?
Julian. Queen f. So instead of b3, why not queen f3 winning a piece? Even stronger. Even stronger. Like I said, I was mesmerized by wanting to win my pawn back. I mean, winning a piece, man, that was really, whoa. Are you sure? You double sure? I mean, you know, I want to win my pawn. So in the Queen's Gambit accepted, if we go back a moment, after the move e3, the principal line, or what is called the main line, is knight f6. One other point. If black plays bishop e6 to defend his pawn, notice that the bishop's not completely comfortable standing in front of the e7 pawn. I would play knight a6, knight a3, I beg your pardon, and I'd still manage to recapture this pawn. Yeah? Okay. So I'm doing the Queen's Gambit, but would you like me to do the declined or accepted? I can continue with the assembly for a moment?
It's up to you.
Okay, fine. So after E3, the B main line is bishop takes C4, and one of the ideas of the Queen's Gambit accepted, from Black's point of view, is he's simply trying to equalize. These moves are considered the main moves, and this very strange move A6. Well, what's the idea of A6? The idea behind A6 is to play B5 and bishop E7. Guess what? Putting the bishop on the long diagonal. Okay. An old favorite of mine is, again, the way I'm schooled in my thinking about space and time, force, pawn structure, king position. My classic knowledge of chess tells me that I have a problem with white in this position. What's my problem? Any guesses?
Dark square bishop.
Dark square bishop. Thank you, sir. Dark square bishop. So in my way of thinking, I would play the move B3. Okay, he's going to put his bishop on the long diagonal. I'm going to do the same. So after a move like B5, I would go back with my bishop, and after a move like bishop B7, thinking deeply into the position, I could play bishop B2, which is a perfectly legit move, and I probably do play bishop B2, I beg your pardon. Bishop B2, knight BG7. And now I look at my knight on B1. I go, the knight on B1. I'm a little bit reluctant. If I bring my knight to C3, well, I do step into a potential attack. I don't want to do that. So I would play the move A4. Very nice. I'm attacking this advanced pawn. And after the move B4, I would play knight on B1 to D2. So what my thinking is, I'm going to bring my knight to this square, which is a very nice outpost. And also, by the way, I bring my knight to this square. A lot of my opponents would capture my pawn on D4, and I capture with this knight. And I'll explain exactly why. In my opinion, what is Black's best piece?
White square bishop.
The white square bishop. So, for me, chess is about recognizing my best pieces. It's about recognizing your best pieces. So after I played knight takes, my idea would be to be bishop F3 and trade your good piece for my, let us say, passive one. If, for example, bishop E7, we can start to see how white is starting to take over the board. If there's a trade, my queen comes out, and immediately we start to notice there's a big weakness on the C6 square. My knight is ready to jump to C6, putting pressure on the queen, and my rook is ready to come to C1, controlling the open file. My knight is ready to come to C4, and this is the way I would play the Queen's Gambit accepted when I was white. So I was about 14 or 15 years old, 3-4 years into chess, as this type of patterned thinking became second nature to me. And somebody, I think his name was Bill McGarry, passed along to me a book, 100 Best Parties of Akiba Rubinstein. Wow, Akiba Rubinstein. Great, so I started reading the book, and I read that Akiba Rubinstein was yeshiva scholar. He had gone to seminary to study Torah, and he fell in love with chess and he ran away. And that he at one time was considered the second best player in the world to the world champion, and everybody thought that Akiva Rubinstein was going to play against Emanuel Lasker for the world championship, a match that didn't take place because World War I interfered. And when I studied the games of Akiva, it's amazing, but Rubinstein played b3 and bishop b2. And I thought, wow, this guy is good. Okay, so that was a brief Queen's Gambit accepted. Other openings to take a look at? What do folks have trouble with?
Well, just in Roy Lopez, I know to develop all my pieces, and I go along lively developing my pieces, and I get them all out.
Wonderful.
And then I don't know what the hell to do.
That's great. That's great. We used to tease. I come from the barbaric Northwest. Very, very, very special place in the Pacific Northwest. And in the early 70s, there was an extremely strong master player from British Columbia. His name was Robert Zook. 3 letters, Z-U-K. And Bob Zook, he was incredibly good at bringing out all of his forces, developing his pieces, reaching the maximum that his pieces could do, and then he had reached what was called, we called the Zook point. So he brought all of his pieces out, he brought them all to the center, he developed everything, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't have the plan, okay. And so we call this the Zook point. You just bring out all your pieces, and then you wait for your opponent to make a mistake. And he was very, very good, and I think it was the winter of 1973-74, Bob Zook went through something like 110 games without a single loss, and won a hell of a lot of games, won tournament after tournament. And so, it's not the worst thing to reach the Zook point. But to your point about E4. Okay, so E4, E5, classical defense. Knight F3, attacking the pawn. Knight C6, defending the pawn. Bishop B5. This move is attributed to a Spanish priest by the name of Ruy Lopez. And so it's from here, from this position, that the Ruy Lopez derives its name. And in the 15th century, a lot of moves were tried. D6, with the idea of bishop D7, was the most common. Another move was knight G8 to E7, defending the knight, defends the pawn, and then playing here, or playing here. And then back in the 1850s, a fellow by the name of Paul Morphe came up with a revolutionary move. This was A7, A6. This became known as the Morphe Defense. Wow! That's so cool. Well, why was that move revolutionary? Well, the thinking had been that the knight defends E5, the bishop comes to attack the knight so that the knight can be captured. Once the knight is captured, the pawn can be captured, but Morphe demonstrated that this was no threat.
Doesn't work, yeah.
Because there was a counter after knight takes queen to d4 with a double attack. So Morphe won several games like this, and they go, wow, that's the Morphe defense. So thanks to queen d4, the idea of bishop takes c6 was started to be considered an impotent threat, that this was not serious and black didn't have to worry about it. So bishop a4 became the standard move.
Can I just ask one question real
Please.
fast? Several times I've played, bishop takes knight there, and have actually had opponents take with the B pawn. And I know from books that you're supposed to just be able to crush that, but I can't figure out how.
Okay, so bishop takes. So in case of pawn takes, my understanding, and again, my understanding is that it starts with takes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, in fact, there.
So you don't have to delay the recapture. You can take it right. You don't have to castle first.
No, you can capture right away. So my understanding is that black now has 2 moves, and only 2 moves. The first move is queen to e7, and the second move is queen to g5. Queen g5 attacking knight, attacking pawn. And then after something, for example, like d4, queen takes, so you get into a position, an endgame, pardon me, where it's considered that after this trade that white has the superior position thanks to his superior center. I mean, it's still a game. It's not like, cut and dry. Another thing is in this position is in case he goes queen e2, not queen g5, but queen e7, I beg your pardon.
That's his pawn.
Pardon?
That's his pawn.
I stole it. I kept it. D4 protects the knight. And now, in case of the move D6, there is knight takes C6. Queen takes E4 check. Oops. Queen E2, because the knight was under attack. Queen takes E2, king takes E2, and we get into a position after bishop B7, D5. Sorry if I'm going a little bit too fast, but this is the basic stuff. And then the guy takes, shadoob, knight here, because black wants to win back his pawn. And the master games that have resulted in this kind of ending have ended up in white's favor. So that this move, b takes c6, they stopped playing it because this ending became favorable.
So the fact that I lost from here was just my fault.
Indeed. But now that I've shown you this, I gotta share with you a story of Boris Spassky. Boris Spassky was playing in the Soviet Championship. And the Soviet Championships that Boris Spassky played in were uber strong. It was just amazing. Essentially, out of the 16 republics that comprised the Soviet Union, the very, very best of all the republics would come, and they would play these massive 20-player round-robin events that would last for months. And getting to just compete in the Soviet Championship was considered phenomenal invitation. Like, you have to be one of the best grandmasters in the world to be able to compete in the Soviet Union. To win one of these Soviet championships were just huge. I mean, then you were lauded. And in the Soviet Union, chess grandmasters were professional. From the state, they received a apartment. They received a monthly stipend. Oftentimes they received a car and a driver, and they even had access to dachas, which were essentially summer homes. So they had a very, very high standard of living, and winning a Soviet championship just gave you enormous, enormous privilege in the Soviet Union. So there's Boris Spassky playing in a Soviet championship, and usually alongside the men's championship, the Soviets also hosted the women's championships. Okay. So Spassky was sitting at dinner with his coach, his second, Grandmaster Tolush. And Spassky does this so much better than me. So he's had dinner with Tolush, and they're discussing their strategy for the next game. And in walks this lady who was playing in the Soviet Championship for the women's. And she was in an extremely foul mood. She was a very temperamental woman. She was very angry. And she took her bird and like kind of wound up and like threw it on the floor and sat down in a humph. So it's something like, Marina, what has happened? Today it's terrible. I have lost a horrible, horrible game and I hate myself. And what's even worse is tomorrow I have the black pieces against this great rival. And, I'm distraught. I don't know what I'm going to do. So Tolush said, tomorrow your opponent will play e4. You must play e5. She will play knight f3. You must play knight c6. And this goes on, this heavy breathing as if it's like natural. She will play bishop to c4, not the Ruy Lopez, but the Italian game. You will play knight d4. She will play knight takes e5. You must play queen g5. She will play knight takes f7. You will play queen takes g2. She will play rook f1. You will play queen takes e4 check. She will play bishop e2. You will play
knight f3.
Mate. Next day at dinner, this woman sashing, same scene, Boris Spassky, world champion Boris Spassky, having a dinner with Grandmaster Tolush, his coach. This woman comes sashaying and takes Tolush by the cheeks, the jowl, shakes on him, plants an enormous kiss on him, right? Lets him go. And she turns with complete and utter disdain towards Spassky. And she says, ha! Then she goes, today I have won brilliantly, just as, Tolush had told her. She looks at Spassky with complete disdain and disgust, says, ha, such a coach, I could be world champion as well. Let's go back to your question about the Ruy Lopez for just a moment. But this was just a fantastic story. I mean, and Spassky says it tells it so much better, but he's just hilarious. Very, very humorful, charming man, Boris Spassky. I played him on numerous occasions, and I have a very, very high regard for him, both as a chess player, but also as just a very wonderful humanitarian person. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4. Now we'll get to so today this is considered the main line, and this is probably what your opponents have done, and you probably castled, yes?
Yes.
So this is all very, very standard opening theory. Now today, there are an enormous amount of ideas for black. Black has been playing b5, bishop b3, bishop c5. He could play the classical bishop c5. he could play what is called the open Spanish, with knight takes e4, d4, b5, bishop e3, d5. This is the open Spanish. It's a big favorite of Victor Korchnoi, and it was a favorite of Bent Larsen. Bent Larsen used the open Spanish to defeat Bobby Fischer in the Piatigorsky Cup. Took place in California. Many choices of what line of defense Black likes to play, but considered the most common is bishop e7. This is the most common defense. White plays rook to e1, and now white is indeed threatening to capture, as Morphe's defense queen d4 no longer works. The knight would retreat, and white's a whole pawn up. So the very standard move today is b5, bishop d3. Now we get into a whole new realm of this goes into what is called the Marshall Gambit. This is a gambit for black. Very famously, Frank Marshall, who came up with this conception, had woke up, had a dream, and Marshall kept a little notebook with a pencil beside his bed, because he said you never know when an inspiring idea might occur to you, and he wanted to write it down. So according to Marshall, he had a dream, and he'd been thinking about chess, and he woke up with this Marshall Gambit in mind. He saved the Marshall Gambit idea for something like 7 years, and he played the world champion, Jose Raul Capablanca, and he sprung his opening surprise that he had looked at for literally years. And Capablanca won the game over the board. So today, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5. These are the standard moves of the Marshall Gambit. And today, the modern move in the Marshall Gambit is c6, d4, bishop d6, rook e1, and literally hundreds of games have continued like this. But Marshall's original conception, which was quite inventive, I mean, he was a remarkable opening theoretician. His original idea, which he played against Capablanca, was to retreat his knight. And what was his idea? His idea was that after the natural move d4, bishop would come to d6, rook would drop back. Then he would spring forward with his knight so that he would be attacking the pawn on h2, and he would follow it up with queen h4. And as I mentioned, Capablanca withstood this ferocious attack and ended up winning the game. So the Marshall Gambit today is one of the favorite defenses of players like Michael Adams and the world's #2 ranked player today, Levon Aronian. So that's really important stuff. One of the greatest practitioners of the black side of the Ruy Lopez is none other than world chess champion, or former world champion, Anatoly Karpov, and he would play the standard move d7, d6. And the idea is to play bishop g4, developing this bishop. White plays h3, castles. And now we get to a whole new gamut of chess defenses for black. Black has a very wide variety of choices in this position. Vasily Smyslov has played h7. Oh, did I do it right? h3 castles, d4. Yeah. h7, h6. is a move. Did I do it right? Have I cheated?
I don't think so.
D6, H3, castles, D4. Right. Me, I hope I didn't cheat. So H6 is a move. Bishop B7 is a move. A5 is a move. There's just a whole variety of moves. Rook E8, knight B D2, bishop F8. Just a second. No, this is. Wait, hold on. I do apologize. Let me just make sure. So bishop B5, A6, bishop A4, knight F6, castles, bishop E7, rook E1, B5, bishop E3, D6, C3, castles, H3. Yes, so I have cheated black from a move. So we have this position, and it is black to move. So bishop B7 and rook E8 is basically Karpov's variation, also known as the Zaitsev. The oldest variation in the Rui is attributed to Michael Chigorin. As you may remember, he was a challenger to Wilhelm Steinitz, the world champion, and the Chigorin variation basically starts in this position with lots and lots of games from this position. Knight BD2, and what White's intentions are to bring his knight to the G3 square. If we just put one of the main variations on the board of the Chigorin, it's very, very difficult for both players in terms of what their overall plans might be. Both players have to be very, very flexible in their thinking. For example, in some cases, black wants to capture the pawn on D4 and very quickly bring a rook onto the C file so that he could attack this bishop on C2. White, for his part, may very oftentimes consider the move D4, D5. So what's the idea of D4, D5? It's basically to artificially isolate this knight. This knight, suddenly, if this knight has to end up retreating to the square B7, you'll notice that it doesn't have a very good circuit. The knight would actually end up being very much out of the game. So against the move D4, D5, which I recommend, by the way, I like gaining space, black has to be very quick in bringing the knight to C4. His idea is quite simply that his knight would be better placed on D7 than on B7. Okay, from this type of a position, it's very common for white to look towards the king side and to develop an initiative on the king side. Well, if you think about it, how are you going to develop initiative on the king side? If white could magically and illegally play the move F2, F4, well, that would be quite good, because that could open up lines of attack. So it's very often that white plays the move knight on F3 to H2. White's idea is to play the move F2, F4. Sometimes he wants to play the move Queen F3 with a threat of bishop takes H6, and sometimes he wants to jump with his knight to G4. Thanks to his advantage in the center and space, the position is considered to white's advantage. And the idea is that white wants to go kingside, and black, thanks to his edge on the queen side, he wants to do some things on the queen side. For example, sometimes black plays for C5, C4, and in case of B4, A5. And normally, this knight ends up going to this square, d7, so that in case f4, we can trade it with our knight on the square e5. Other questions about some openings? I don't want to keep you too long. Queen's Gambit decline. Okay, we'll go back for a moment to the Queen's Gambit decline. I have been a long-time practitioner of the Queen's Gambit decline as black. I think that it's one of the most stable defenses against 1d4, and I've had pretty good overall success with it. But even more importantly, I haven't been, let's say, crushed early. In fact, usually in case I lose, it's because my opponent was forced to play a pretty darn good game. So d4, d5, c4, e6. These are the standard moves of the Queen's Gambit decline. And today, what's very interesting is that Emanuel Lasker's, so far these are all very, very standard moves. Emanuel Lasker's freeing maneuver, the so-called freeing maneuver, has become one of the most popular features in top Grandmaster play. So if we take a look at this position for just a second, it's not Monday Night Football, it's something happening. If we take a look at this position from White's point of view for just a second, White's rather happy. From the space count, he has 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10. And from Black's point of view, Black only attacks 2 of these squares with his pawn and 2 of these squares with his knight. So Black's behind in space. Fair enough. So from what Lasker did is he said a space advantage is only important if there are a lot of pieces on the board. If a lot of the pieces come off the board, the advantage in space is reduced. So Lasker liked to play the move knight f6 to e4. Okay, so obviously the bishops are in contact. Now the bishops are traded off. Bishop, queen. Now it was established that knight takes f4, d takes e4, knight d2, f5. Sorry, let me just put that on the board, was not a cause of concern for the second player. In other words, the second player got a pretty reasonable game in this position. If you trade, he would take, or maybe play knight c6 and knight takes, and Black's position was, in Grandmaster practice, proven to be quite viable. So, what became the major move was rook c1. Now after rook c1, knight takes, rook takes. So from Black's point of view, having traded a pair of pieces off the board, well, okay. White still has his nice center, he still has an edge in space, and a very surprising move became very popular thanks to Emanuel Lasker. What Lasker did was he played c6. Wow, what kind of move was that? Essentially, oops, I think this bishop is on f1, I beg your pardon. What Lasker is essentially saying, it's your turn, go ahead and make your best move. If you trade pawns, you'll open up this light squared bishop for me, you'll help me. So White said, well, I'll develop my bishop. What Lasker did was he traded, knight d7. We understand this bishop is a problem. And this is how he sold his bishop. After the move castles, what Lasker did is he goes E5. So in case of a capture, 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 we see that Lasker's next move is he's going to play bishop e6 and completely neutralize the position. Once he gets to go bishop e6 and rook b8, there's no advantage whatsoever in the position for white. And so this, today, this variation has become one of the popular ways for black to neutralize 1d4. And a lot of players are no longer playing bishop g5, but they're playing bishop f4 very early on move 4 or move 5 to avoid this.